All right, so a couple of things. So we're going to start with 2007, and this one's a little bit older, so it's organized a little differently, right? So the 2007, it's organized a little bit more, a little differently now, so I'm going to show you how it's organized. We're going to read it in that way, okay? Couple of things. You have 2 hours. Now, the College Board has also given you an additional 15 minutes, all right? So the way that the clock runs is you will have 2 hours, 15 minutes up there. The clock just runs, it won't stop. Your 15 minutes, your first 15 minutes are supposed to be used for your synthesis. You can work any way you want in the essays, but I discourage that highly. I say start with your synthesis. So in those 15 minutes, as the clock's running, you need to be reading through your sources. At the end of 15 minutes, there will be an announcement that says it is now suggested that you move on to your first essay, right? They'll kind of move you through that way. So within those 15 minutes, the same way we kind of break down rhetorical analysis timing, I say you need to do 10 minutes of reading and annotating, and then 5 minutes of planning. Now, what is hard is that people feel the more time they spend in synthesis, because it's a little bit easier, it's the highest scoring essay out of the 3, people feel that the more time they spend, it's worthwhile. What happens is people start getting sucked into synthesis and they end up spending an hour instead of the 40 minutes. All right? So think, if you spend an extra 20 minutes on this essay, you're taking 10 minutes away from rhetorical analysis, 10 minutes away from argument, or 20 minutes away from one of them, right? And we're already scratching the surface just to get 40 minutes and to write everything in 40 minutes. So you cannot afford to spend any extra time on this, which is why 10 minutes reading, 5 minutes planning, and then you need to just use your 40 minutes writing, because it is longer. Now, this is the one that I scored this summer, and my friends that were in rhetorical analysis or argument would come up probably every couple of folders, and in each folder there's 25 essays. And every couple of folders, they'd come up with a blank page. And like, as a reader, you're like, sweet, a blank page. You're like, one less one that I have to grade. You get really excited about it, right? But it doesn't happen that way in synthesis, so because it's the first one that everybody writes. So out of the 1,000 essays, I didn't have one blank page. Now, I did have 9-page 2s, and I had 3-page 8s. So the length of your essay does not matter, right? We will read it from beginning to end. So that person that spent all that time writing 9 pages obviously took a ton of time off of somewhere else, because you're not writing 9 pages in 40 minutes, right? And scoring a 3. All right? So we have to be kind of very careful in that time period. And you guys will see it. The only time what's hard for us in class is that we will not have the time to give you 15 minutes and then 40 minutes, right? So the only time that you will actually see how that feels for that full time will be the day that we do our mock exam. All right, which will be when we come back, probably on one of those star days. All right, so let me show you kind of the order that it is in now. So I'm going to number it. So this now comes first, the assignment comes second, and the directions come third. All right, so we're going to kind of read it in that order. So the introduction is your like background information, and it addresses the issue. So museums are collections of artifacts. Although museums can represent interests from fine arts to whaling, people who visit museums sometimes fail to realize that every exhibit, every display case, represents a series of human decisions. Some individual or group of individuals has to decide to include a particular piece of art or specific artifact in the museum's collection. Read the following sources, including the introductory information, carefully. Then, write an essay in which you develop a position on the most important considerations facing the person responsible for securing a new work of art or an artifact for a museum. Synthesize at least 3 of your sources. All right, where is your task? Develop a position on the most important considerations. So notice that this is an argument. So no matter what, you're still writing this like an argument paper. You're still taking a position, you're still giving your assertions, you're still giving your evidence. All right? facing the person responsible, you are going to be that person. So you are taking on the persona of someone that is working for a museum, right? Trying to get artifacts. Now, why this is important is because this creates your voice in your essay. So this will move you away from just having a DBQ or just evidence. You're going to actually have the voice of the person working at the museum. All right? What is the main idea? What is the main rule in there that you have to follow? You have to use 3. I'm going to tell you to use 4. And here's the reason why. If you don't use 3, first of all, if you only cite 2, and citing means I need internal citation. If you do not have internal citation, yet you have a quote from a source, I can't give you that as credit. So unless you cite it internally, I can't give you credit. Now, you can say in Rockefeller's essay or in Rockefeller's book, right, that would count as a citation, but I still tell you if you say in Rockefeller's book, at the end of it, I still need you to cite that source, just to be sure. The other reason why I tell you not to do 3 is because we have graphs and charts. The last few years, graphs and charts have been predominant on our, at least one of the sources. So there's always one visual. The last 3 or 4 years, there's been at least one graph or chart on there. And I'm going to tell you that across the country, juniors are terrible at reading graphs and charts. Last year especially, I can't tell you, I had probably a large handful of kids that only used 3 sources. One of their sources was the graph, and they misread the graph. Which means even if they cited it, it doesn't count. So they only cited 2 sources. So that's why I tell you to use 4, because if you use one wrong or interpret one wrong, then you still have a third to back up on. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm going to walk you through how to use 4 and kind of like how to get article or how to get sources to talk to each other. So the directions. The question requires you to synthesize a variety of sources into a coherent, well-written essay. Synthesis refers to combining the sources in your position to form a cohesive, supported argument and accurately citing sources. Your argument should be central. The sources should support this argument. Avoid merely summarizing the sources. This right here is a DBQ. God bless our history teachers, but I don't want a DBQ. Remember to attribute both direct and indirect citations. So that means if you are quoting or if you are paraphrasing, which when we start writing, I'm going to tell you to do both. Okay, last thing. Look at the sources. So here are your sources. So notice we have, 6 sources? We have anywhere usually between 5 to 7 sources. The more recent sources are full pages, and there were 7 of them. 7 full-page articles. So for the most part, you probably aren't going to get through all 7. So we'll have strategies of when you get to an article that you don't understand, when you get to a source you don't understand, or if you're running out of time and you haven't gotten to all the sources. We'll have a plan on how to address those. All right? So notice, you can cite either source A through F, or you can cite the MLA, right? I tell you to use the letter. Why? Because I was the one that was creating them, and if I had to go back and look at names, it took me longer to make sure that you used the correct name, and that was the name that was on the MLA citation, and you used not the same, you used 3 different ones than it was for me just to find 3 letters, right? Now I can tell you, we know the sources in and out. So the first day we get there, other groups are starting to grade within like the first 3 or 4 hours. We spent 6 hours going over the sources. So every day when we came in, they quizzed us. They're like, all right, the first day, they're like, all right, write down the sources. Like, who were the authors of the sources? Like, we had to know that. right? Like write down, here's a fact, what source does that come from? We had to know what source. Like literally I cried for 2 nights because I was like, I can't do this anymore. I want to go home. And my roommate was like, no, it's okay. And I'm like, no, it's terrible. It was like the worst. This is like the worst, the hardest one to grade, I think. So make sure, just make it easier on us by writing the letter. Okay, even in your embedding, if you say, you know, in his book, Rockefeller states, I would still at the very end of it cite source A. I can't tell you how many times I read an essay that had a quote in it without mentioning the author's name and no source. And it doesn't count even though I knew what source it came from. It didn't count. The other thing is, let's say in the Rockefeller article, let's say the Rockefeller article was written by Rockefeller, but they interview Smith, and Smith talks the whole entire time. Students would cite Smith, not Rockefeller. Doesn't count. Because the internal citation says Rockefeller, not Smith. So that's why I say no matter who you're talking about, go back and write source A, the letter at the end. Make sense? All right. Before we move on, now what I want you to do is I want you to start planning. So what are we looking for?
Most important consideration.
Thank you. What do we need to consider? All right, so let's brainstorm. So here's the thing. I think you should brainstorm before you go in, and here's the reason why. If you don't brainstorm before you go into the sources, all you're going to spit back is what the sources have to say. Then you're just giving me a book report. So this is helping you to build your own argument. Now I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you a couple synthesis topics that you have no clue what they're talking about and have no idea of how to prep for it, right? So we'll go over those and have some strategies for those. So right now, let's put ourselves in the position of somebody that works at the museum. We have an artifact or a group of artifacts sitting in front of us. What do we, as being part of this museum, need to consider?
Customer appeal.
Okay, customer appeal. What does that mean?
Like how much people would go to the museum in their life.
Okay, so is there interest in it? Okay, good. Nick, what else did you have?
Its meaning.
What do you mean?
Like what the artifact represents, or who, like why the person made it.
Okay. What else? So we need to make sure that background information. So, and part of that is like, is it real, right? Like we need to be able to consider, like, is this artifact from where it says it is from, right? Whoever's selling it to us, is it real? Does it come from whatever generation that it says it comes from? Is it made of what it says it's made of, right? So we have to do some research on that. What else?
Quality.
What do you mean?
Like if it's too broken, then maybe it shouldn't be displayed.
Okay.
What about like how well it fits in with like everything else?
Yeah, how well it fits in with what? Like their current
Art.
or like the theme of the museum, right? Because some museums have, are very specific to a certain theme. Okay, what else?
Price.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with cost, you look at, like, is it worth it now, right? Is it going to make more money? Like, is it going to increase in value? Anything else? All right, that's a good list. So when we go into reading an article, we want to see, okay, does this article fit under our categories, and what is it actually saying about one of our categories? So let's look at source A. So it looks very familiar to a DBQ, right? To sources with the DBQ. So what you have at the top, you have the source information. So what we find here is we find that this is why I make you do your Works Cited page so you know all the pieces and parts. So that's an author. What type of source is this? It's a book. When was it published? To 2007, is it pretty current? Yeah. Okay. Now you look and see, is there any bias? Sometimes you can tell bias in a title. Here, it doesn't really tell us anything. But we just want to take that into consideration. So, not that some sources are bad, but I feel like some sources that are like a blog, I feel like those aren't great sources. It's just an opinion piece, right? So you have to be very careful sometimes of the sources. Not that they're bad, but I just don't think they're as good as some of the other ones. Now, what you have in italics is you have background information about the source. Now, sometimes there's a lot on there, sometimes there's not. If there is information there, the College Board thinks it's vital that you understand it because it goes into the purpose of the article. Sometimes it will just say it's an excerpt from a book, and that's all there is, okay? The other thing that you want to look for is if it's a book or like a magazine, like who is the audience? That sometimes will play into it. So let's read the background of this book. While John D. Rockefeller Jr. funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, his wife Abby Aldrich was a driving force behind the creation of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. This excerpt from the autobiography written by their son, David Rockefeller, discusses a bleak financial period for the MoMA. All right, so now listen, when you annotate, here's what I need you annotating for. Your annotation is different than what you would do on a rhetorical analysis. I need you reading these quickly, but I need you reading them only for evidence that is vital to your argument. Little bits and pieces, not full lines, okay? The other thing that I want to warn you of is, and this is hard, try two things. One, try not to pick a piece of evidence that everybody else is going to pick, right? I would say 60% of the essays, 70% of the essays that I read last year, most of their evidence was all the same. Gets a little monotonous. Now, I'm not telling you to find the hard stuff, but kind of be watching out for something that's interesting. Two, don't choose a piece of evidence that says the exact same thing as your assertion. I'm seeing a lot of that when you guys were showing me your outlines. Your piece of evidence said the exact same thing that your assertion said. That doesn't really support anything. It just restates your assertion. So you need to find evidence that supports the assertion being made. Does that make sense? And that's what I wasn't seeing in some of your outlines. All right, so as I read, you guys mark. You ready? Below the surface, however, two critical business problems threaten the institution: money and management. The recurring operating deficit approached $1 million a year and was worsening. Our 13th anniversary endowment campaign had raised $25.6 million, but the annual deficits quickly eroded this reserve. Our financial woes were exacerbated by a poor management structure, a result of a decentralized system in which each department enjoyed considerable autonomy in terms of exhibitions, acquisitions, and programs. Furthermore, influential trustees often aligned themselves with the curators of departments in which they had a special interest and for which they became strong advocates and financial backers. Since no one wanted to antagonize important trustees, exhibitions and acquisitions were often approved without regard for overall policy guidelines or the museum's fragile financial condition. This unbusinesslike process was symptomatic of a deeper problem: the lack of consensus about the composition of the MoMA's permanent collection and the direction our collecting should take in the future. Some trustees strongly advocate continuing to collect the work of emerging contemporary artists while carefully culling the collection of its less outstanding holdings to finance new acquisitions. So, before we move forward, what is their big argument? Before you move on, after you read, I want you to tell me, what is the big argument? Don't look at what it says. Tell me what you remember. What is it talking about? Key point. Nick?
The cost of, running the museum, wasn't being managed efficiently.
Okay, so the cost of running the museum Wasn't managed well. Okay, so one thing that we can write down are what are some new ideas that we didn't have before that we need to consider?
Like higher up people pressing on them.
So like the management, also the management press, the financial backer pressures, I should say. Those are new ideas. Okay? What category do we think of the ideas that we already talked about do we think this article fits well under? What does it speak to? Okay. The price of what, though? So it talks about money, right? Okay. So let's jot down. What are things that we need to consider if we're the person that is getting ready to buy an artifact? What do we need to consider after we've read this article about money?
Museum's other expenses.
Okay, so we need to consider the museum's other expenses. Okay. What else dealing with money do we need to worry about?
The potential for fraud.
Okay. Because we have to make money somewhere, right? All right, so does this artifact, money-wise, we need to worry about, is there other expenses that will hinder us getting this? Will it bring any money back to the museum? What else? I think that last paragraph is really important. When we're purchasing something, what must we consider?
The whole value.
For what? The whole value of what?
Like how it contributes to the museum as a whole. Do you want me to highlight the change too?
Please. Are all those things having to deal with money? Yeah. So you can write a whole paragraph right now just about money. Jordan. Wah, wah.
There's also 2 essays you didn't grade
Okay.
of the sophomore.
Okay. Does that make sense? So now, even though these are all things that have to do with money, that's a paragraph that we can write about money. Now, as we read the next source, we want to see, is there anything that pays into or supports one of these ideas? Does that make sense? Let's do one more, because the next one I think is the hard one. All right. Source B. What? Yep. Source B. Okay, so notice that this is the title of, obviously, the painting. Is there going to be bias in this? The artist and his museum. Yeah, so there's going to be a little bias. It's a painting from 1822. All right, so let's read the background. Charles Peale, an eminent portrait painter, established the first art gallery, natural history museum, and art school in the United States. Unlike earlier European museums, largely royal collections with access limited to scholars and government officials, Peale's museum was notable as a private institution devoted to and reliant upon public patronage. Peale's museum combined artworks and artifacts, which grew from a small sampling of curiosities in the 1780s to a large and impressive collection of scientifically classified specimens in the 1820s. Peale also offered his visitors performers, a zoo, and an intriguing assembly of biological oddities such as a 2-headed pig, a root resembling a human face, and a 5-legged cow with no tail. Okay, so first of all, what is the main idea? What is this talking about? Okay, so the creation or the purpose of. And what was his purpose? And what made his different?
It was for everyone.
Yes,
Instead of like higher up.
Yes. So his was the first one, right? To where it wasn't something special, just for the rich. It was for everybody. Now, what the easy part in here would be to use pieces of this as pieces of evidence, like the background information, which is totally okay. What is a little different is if you actually take the painting itself, and if you get a painting, it's the print is a little bit better than this one. But what are some pieces of evidence from this painting that you can use to say that he opened up his to the public and made it something different than what it was before? Yeah, so the curtain, right? So what does the curtain show? But I mean, what does it do? What?
I was just saying he's like unveiling it.
Yeah, it's making it not so secretive, not private, right? So usually behind curtains are like things that only certain people can see, right? And what you notice too in the piece of art, like you notice these little things down here. So this is like a taxidermy of like a turkey or a bird, and then here is a skull. And then each one of these these are like individual squares that have different artifacts. And then notice that you have people and children in the background. So you have women, you have men, you have children, you have a variety of artifacts. And then what else was his other purpose? Appeal to the public. And then what else did he give the public?
Entertainment.
Yeah, entertainment. There you go. So his might not have necessarily been for learning. He was trying to open it up for entertainment. And because of that entertainment, he got more people to come, which allowed him to show more things off. Does that make sense? And the other thing that he did was he had biological oddities. So he was different than other museums, because he offered something different. Does that make sense? Now, what you're going to do for the last bit of like 15 minutes is I need you to go through the rest of the sources, and you need to annotate them this way. The one thing that I want you to do that we haven't been able to do is I need you to get the sources to talk to each other. If you have one that supports what another one is saying, connect them. Source C and source A are saying the same thing with different pieces of evidence. Or maybe C contrasts what A says. So find a way to connect the sources, whether they contrast each other or whether they connect to each other. So last year when that's what I would give a 7 to, is the one thing that they did better was getting the sources to talk to each other. Does that make sense? So you have about 15 minutes. I need you to get through C through F, right?
Yes.
C through F. And